All right, in this video, we're going to go over ref and output parameters. And ref and out are two of the four types of parameters that you can pass into a method. Basically, what they're used for is to return multiple pieces of value data back into the call site of a method. So instead of returning one value, like you could normally do with the method, you can use them to actually return multiple values. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new project and a console application. As far as the difference between ref and out, they're actually very, very similar. We'll see the difference in a moment. Basically, it's all about whether or not the variable you pass in needs to be initially initialized before you can call the method. But to demonstrate ref and out, I'm going to use a pretty straightforward example. I'm actually going to implement a method that is part of the .NET framework itself that you might have used at some point. It's very handy. It's called try parse. I'm going to go ahead and say static bool try parse. I'm going to just say try parse int, and then I'll pass in a string as input. So the goal of this method is to, and then, well, of course, I need the output ref parameter. The goal of this method is to try to take this input string and turn it into an integer. It'll return true or false whether or not it failed. In addition, it'll also set a variable that we pass in to the result of the method. So in essence, we are returning two pieces of information.
Right, the bool and the integer. Okay.
So to make a ref parameter, all you have to do is add the ref keyword. So I'm going to say ref. I'm going to just call this return value. Terrible name. And I'm going to give it a type, of course, which is going to be int. So I'm going to be a little hacky with this. I'm just going to say try really quickly, and then I'm going to say return value equals int.parse, and then pass in input. Int.parse will throw an exception if the parsing failed, which will go into this code right here. Then, immediately after that return value is set, I'm just going to return out true. Finally, at this exception block, I'm going to return out false because the try parse failed, or the parsing failed because an exception was ultimately thrown. So in order to invoke the try parse int method, you have to already have an integer initialized to a particular value, and then you have to invoke try parse with both a string and a reference to that value. So I'm going to go ahead and say
yeah, basically you're setting up your catcher variable. You know, the dude who's going to catch the information that's referenced back out.
Yep. So we're going to do that.
Yep.
No, I'm agreeing with you. I'm just typing at the same time. Alrighty. Okay, so the invoking a method with a reference parameter is actually very straightforward. We can use the return type just like normal. Again, the return type of this method determines whether or not the parsing was successful or not. And then we also have to pass in a reference to a integer, and because we have a reference parameter here. So in this case, the ref keyword is basically saying, take this particular integer, not a copy of the integer, not the value of 0. Take this integer, this one that's sitting on the stack in this main method, and pass its address.
That's right.
Over into this method.
Very well
through
said.
This return value. And how that works is now this return value variable is literally pointing to the same data as this.
Meaning that down inside the try on line 21, if return value was to indeed get something back, we're actually setting that value in the address that's being pointed to, which is going to be back in the stack on the frame at line 10 with the result holding what we need it to hold.
Right. So yeah, and then of course, in addition to that, we also, like I said before, multiple times, we get the benefit of a normal return value.
Right.
Which we can use to wrap this in a nice if statement.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I mean, if I were to run this code, obviously I'll get 1, 2, 3, 4. If I were to change this to something else, I would
prove
get
it.
a failure. All right, well, fine.
Fine, but you better, yeah, thank you, do a read line or a read key or something.
Okay, so in this case, we're going to get 1, 2, 3, 4. We successfully parsed out that data.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if I were to change the string to an invalid integer, what's going to happen is this is going to throw an exception. It's going to be caught. False is going to be sent back into this if statement, which is going to not be executed, and instead it's going to execute the else statement.
Very nice.
So
Gotcha.
we failed to parse the string.
All right, Zach, how are you feeling about how ref works?
I see what's going on here.
Awesome. So let's go ahead and move on to out.
There are two major differences between ref and out. Basically, in C#, the concept of a definitely assigned variable is important. And every single variable that you ever use in C# passed to a method or whatever needs to be definitely assigned. And what that means is that the C# compiler does a bunch of magic, looks at all your if statements and switch statements, and figures out, has this variable ever been given an initial value before it's used? Now, ref requires that whatever value you pass in, or whatever value that's at the address that you passed in, is definitely assigned. In which case, in this case, it is, because we assigned it to 0 in this case. If I were to say, well, in addition to that, ref does not require that we even set this inside of this method of the body. So we can, we could just comment this out. This would be worthless, but we could. This, just to demonstrate the difference between ref and out, we could not possibly set this value. Now, an output parameter is slightly different. The two main differences between out is, of course, using out instead of ref, and then also at the call site using out instead of ref. But in addition, we'll see two things. We'll first of all see that ReSharper is telling us that we don't have to definitely assign this variable, which is true. I can go ahead and delete that initial assignment, and you'll see that this code still works. Previously, it wouldn't if it was a reference parameter. But because it's an output parameter, that means that the variable does not need to be definitely assigned before it enters the method that has the output parameter.
But it's going to be assigned at some point.
Exactly. So that's why we get an error right here instead. Parameter return value must be assigned upon exit. So this is the C# engine saying, wait a sec, if int.parse throws an exception, we're never going to set return value, and that's illegal. So on the next return statement, we're going to say, hey, there's a problem. You need to set return value to something before the method exits. And we can do just that, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
So that's pretty much the difference between ref and out and what they do. Generally, I mean, a ref in this case would be more appropriate, but let's say we have a method that grabs 10 integers from a file.
Mm-hmm.
Now, although I would normally have like a return signature of like IEnumerable of type int, but if we wanted to use ref output parameters, we could have 5 int output parameters and not have to initialize them before we call the method that gets them out of something.
Mm-hmm.
But and
nowadays, you generally don't prefer much using these guys, do you?
Well, that too. The biggest problem I have with ref and out is that obviously, first of all, they require ref and out in the call site, which is annoying. But that's not a big one.
Okay,
that's good.
The second problem is that you have to have a line of code, at least one line of code per ref or output parameter before you call the method. Because you have to define, or not define, but declare all of these variables before you call them.
And if it's ref, then you have to define it anyway.
Well, yeah, you have to define and declare, but if it's out, you have to declare it.
Right.
Either way, that's still a line of code per parameter that you have to use. If this had 3 output parameters or 3 ref parameters, I'd have to have 3 additional lines of code right here to declare all the variables.
Exactly. So what do you prefer when needing to send multiple things back out of a method? Well,
generally what I would do instead, and I can go ahead and just write this up real fast, maybe in a different guy. As of .NET 4, we have a new type to play with called Tuples. And if you are Python, Ruby, F#, Haskell, OCaml, or any other primarily functional language programmer, you'll be right at home with tuples, but they're a new addition to C#. And basically, they just allow us to return multiple values. So I'm going to have a tuple that returns a Boolean and an integer. And then I'm going to take the same method body and copy and paste it over. But instead of returning true, we're going to return tuple.create, and then we're going to pass in true, comma, int parse input. And then instead of returning false, we're going to return tuple.create false, comma 0.
Okay, so it's just kind of a way to piggyback some more information.
Yep, exactly, onto returning more than one piece of information from a method. So then I'm going to copy and paste this code. I'm not going to need this, and this is, actually, no, I'm not going to copy and paste that code. I'm just going to type it out. I'm going to say tuple bool int result equals result2 equals try parsed int 2, pass in whatever. Now I can say if result2.item1 console.writeLine, we parsed out result2.item2, otherwise fail. And also, in addition to this, I would, of course, always be using implicit typing just to make it cleaner, but for sake of clarity, I'm using explicit typing here. So basically, in cases where I find myself wanting to return more than one value, I will most likely use tuples, or I will create a data structure to hold those values being returned, because I just really don't like having to declare a bunch of variables before I invoke a method. That just kind of bugs me. In addition, this defeats immutability, but that's irrelevant. So, yeah, as far as ref and out go, what they're used for and what alternatives there are you pretty good with that, Zach?
Yes, I am.
Yeah, it's a very, very clean presentation. Easy to understand.
One more caveat to this, though. And that is, I'm going to collapse all this code because now the code is irrelevant. What I'm going to show you is that if you are overloading a method, you cannot overload based off whether or not it's out or ref. So I'll prove that here. String input, ref int return value. Now you cannot overload these two. This method cannot be overloaded if the only difference is one of the output parameters is a ref or the other way around. The reason is, if you look at this error, this actually might be kind of confusing until you know something. And the error is member with the same signature is already declared. Well, obviously it's not the same signature, but unfortunately, according to the actual code that the C# compiler emits, ref and out are the same thing. As normally this wouldn't matter. Normally this would just be an implementation detail, blah, blah, blah. But ref and out are conceptually the same thing as far as .NET's concerned. The only thing is C# puts a little bit more requirements on the output parameter. And the consequence of this is like what you see here. You cannot overload based off ref and out alone.
Okay.
Okay.
Fantastic. Well, does that pretty much wrap up everything that you wanted to talk about?
Yeah.
All right. Excellent. Well, that will conclude this video. Thank you all very much.